We didn't go in there looking for ghosts. That's the first thing people get wrong about places like this. We went in because we were 22, bored, and possessed by that specific brand of suburban arrogance that makes you feel like nothing can actually hurt you. Mark had the heavy-duty flashlight, and I had my phone. The screen cracked and dimming. We climbed through a section of the perimeter fence that had been pulled back like a rusted flap of skin, and then we were just standing there in the grass of the Northview grounds, staring up at the Kirkbride building. It was massive. It wasn't spooky. It was just oppressive. It sat there like a rotting weight on the landscape. A Victorian pile of brick and barred windows that felt like it was actively displacing the air around it. The silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't the quiet of the woods or a sleeping neighborhood. It was a vacuum. Even the wind seemed to die before it reached the walls. "You good?" Mark asked. His voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual bass. He didn't wait for an answer. He just started walking toward the basement entrance, a half-submerged door where the wood had long ago surrendered to the damp. The smell hit us as soon as we crossed the threshold. It wasn't just dust or mold. It was a thick, cloying scent of wet minerals, copper, and something sharp, like old medicine that had gone sour in the heat. It felt like breathing in a physical substance. The floor was a minefield of shattered glass and tiles that had buckled upward into jagged peaks. Mark's flashlight beam cut a harsh, surgical white path through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint that hung from the ceiling in long, grey ribbons, looking like strips of dead skin. We didn't talk. We couldn't. Every time I opened my mouth to say we should head back, the words felt heavy and useless. We moved deeper, past the administrative offices, where filing cabinets had been turned inside out, their paper contents forming a pulpy carpet on the floor. I saw a patient intake form from 1954, half buried in the muck. The ink bled out into a blue bruise. We reached the central staircase. The wrought iron was rusted to the point of being brittle, and as we climbed, the groan of the metal was the only sound in the world. On the third floor, the atmosphere shifted. This was the ward. The long, narrow corridor stretched out ahead of us, and the geometry of it felt wrong. It was too long, the perspective skewed by the way the doors on either side were all slightly ajar, creating a rhythmic pattern of shadows that seemed to pulse as we moved. Mark stopped. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, the flashlight beam fixed on a point about 30 feet ahead. "Josh," he whispered. I looked. There was nothing there, just the empty hallway. But as I stared into the dark, I felt a wave of cold, physical dread wash over me, a prickling sensation that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was the sudden, crushing realization that we were somewhere we were never meant to be. "Let's go up," Mark said, his voice shaking. He didn't want to go back through the hallway. We found the hydrotherapy room. It was a tiled cavern with heavy clawfoot tubs bolted to the floor. The flashlight beam hit the water still sitting in one of them, stagnant, black, and perfectly still. I looked at the leather straps still hanging from the side of the middle tub. They weren't rotted. They looked supple, as if they had been oiled recently. I felt a sudden, frantic urge to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through waist-deep water. Mark turned the light toward the corner of the room. There was a chair there, a simple wooden chair facing the wall. It was the most mundane object in the room, but seeing it there, so deliberately placed, made my stomach turn over. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, a sound started. It wasn't a scream or a footstep. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming. It sounded like a heartbeat. It was coming from the walls. The floorboards under my boots began to vibrate. It was a deep, sub-bass frequency that you feel in your teeth more than you hear in your ears. Mark started to pan the light around the room frantically. "There's someone here," he hissed. "Josh, there's someone here." "There's nobody here, Mark." "Shut up," I said, but my voice was a broken rasp. We backed out of the hydrotherapy room and into a smaller transition corridor. The thrumming got louder. It was an industrial sound, like a massive engine idling deep underground, but it was irregular, catching and skipping. I looked down the length of the hall toward the way we'd come, but the darkness there was different now. It was a solid, matte black that the flashlight beam couldn't penetrate. The light just stopped. Mark started hyperventilating. The sound of his jagged, panicked breathing was the loudest thing in the world. "I can't see the stairs," he whimpered. "Josh, where are the stairs?" The layout of the floor had changed. I knew it was impossible. I knew it was a trick of the light and the panic. But the door we had just come through wasn't there anymore. There was just a smooth, blank wall of damp plaster. We were in a box, a small, tiled box that smelled of old blood and copper. The thrumming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a heavy, physical pressure on my eardrums. I looked at Mark. He was staring at the corner of the ceiling, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide and vacant. He wasn't blinking. "Mark?" I whispered. He didn't respond. He just slowly raised his hand and pointed. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep my eyes on the floor. But I looked. There was nothing in the corner. No shadow, no figure, no ghost. But there was a hole. A small, jagged hole in the plaster where the lath was showing through. And from that hole, a liquid was beginning to seep. It wasn't water. It was a thick, translucent amber fluid that moved with a heavy, syrupy consistency. It crawled down the wall, defying gravity in some places, branching out like a map of veins. And then the voice started. It wasn't a voice from outside. It was a voice that sounded like it was being spoken from inside my own skull, using my own vocal cords to vibrate against my brain. It didn't use words. It used memories. I felt the sudden, overwhelming grief of a funeral I'd attended when I was 8. I felt the sharp, stinging shame of a childhood lie. I felt every moment of pure, unadulterated terror I'd ever experienced, all compressed into a single, agonizing second. I fell to my knees. "Please," Mark whispered. It was the only word he could manage. He dropped the flashlight. It hit the floor and the lens shattered, the bulb flickering and dying, leaving us in total, absolute darkness. In the dark, the scale of the room vanished. I couldn't tell if I was in a small closet or a vast cathedral. I reached out for Mark, but my hand met nothing but empty, cold air. I called his name, but no sound came out of my throat. I was untethered. I felt like I was drifting in a void where the only constant was the sensation of being watched by something. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were too long. It didn't pull me or push me. It just rested there, a heavy, dead weight. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just closed my eyes and waited for the end of the world. I don't know how long I sat there. Time had stopped functioning. I opened my eyes. I was back in the main hallway on the 3rd floor. The sun was starting to come up, casting long, pale shadows across the debris. Mark was sitting against the opposite wall. He looked 10 years older. His hair was matted with dust and his clothes were torn. He was staring at his hands, which were shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his armpits. We didn't say a word. We stood up, our joints aching as if we'd been beaten, and we walked out. We walked down the stairs, through the basement, and out into the morning air. The sun felt wrong. The birds singing in the trees sounded like static. We reached the car, and Mark handed me the keys because he couldn't drive. As I started the engine, I looked back at the building one last time. It was just a building, old, ruined, and empty. I've spent the last few days trying to pull it all apart. I keep telling myself it was the environment. I've been reading about how old buildings like that are basically traps for things that mess with the human head. The mold, for one. Black mold spores can cause literal hallucinations and intense paranoia if you breathe enough of them in a cramped space. Then there's the infrasound. Wind moving through those long, empty corridors can create low-frequency vibrations that you can't hear, but they mess with your inner ear and trigger a fight-or-flight response. It makes you feel like someone is standing right behind you. It can even make your vision blur in the corners, making you think you're seeing movement or leaking walls. I want to believe that's all it was. I want to believe that Mark and I just worked each other into a state of hysterical, oxygen-deprived panic. We were two guys in a dark, terrifying place, our brains starved for light and fresh air, feeding off each other's fear until our senses just broke. The amber liquid, the voice in my head, the room changing shape. It was probably just my mind trying to make sense of a sensory blackout. A trick of the light, or a trick of the lack of light. I'm not sure what happened. I'll probably never be sure. Part of me knows it was just a physical reaction to a bad environment. A cocktail of mold, carbon monoxide, and pure raw nerves. It's the only thing that makes sense. Thanks for staying until the end. If you're enjoying these kind of stories, hit like and subscribe. It really does help this channel grow. There is a full playlist on your screen right now if you want to keep going. I'll see you in the next one. And until then, sleep well.